Today we're going to be discussing the Progressive Era, which was a period of widespread social activism and political reform throughout America that we usually characterize between the years of 1890 and the 1920s. So think of Teddy Roosevelt and the Trust Busters, or Woodrow Wilson and the graduated um, income tax. The main objectives of the progressive movement were addressing problems that had emerged during industrialization, urbanization, and these changes to society that are also characterized by demographic changes of immigration and problems in government that we've discussed, like Boss Tweed. So the progressives are a group of social activists that are interested in reforming and establishing progress for society. But one of the things I want to think about is the progressives in a larger context of those traditionally identified between 1890 and 1920. Instead, we see progressivism's legacy continue throughout society, particularly in how we see the role of government in our modern society. So, in the 1930s, the questions that related to the progressive legacy really had to do with the economy. In the 1930s, America was experiencing an unprecedented depression, the Great Depression, and a lot of people started to ask, how can we improve society, specifically economically? And a lot of people, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, believed that the government could be an active agent in this economic improvement. So, progressives of the 1930s are interested in regulating banks to make sure that they are more transparent and more accountable for their business transactions, or the stock market as well. So think the FDIC, federally insured banks, and the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, that regulated the stock market. You also saw progressivism's legacy in Social Security, the emergence of Social Security, where now the government is involved in your individual planning for retirement. You can also, in another area, is was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or then later the emergence of the Department of Agriculture, where now the government can potentially intervene in certain sectors of of agriculture. In the 1930s, it was to subsidize certain areas for planters not to plant and flood the market. In 1950s, the legacy of progressivism comes into the role of federal government, particularly in society around, surrounding civil rights. You can see Brown versus Board of Education, where the federal government and its role in education and desegregation of schools. The 1960s are a great example of the legacy of progressivism. And while we often think of America's diversion outward towards Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson's administration also focused heavily on social reforms, looking towards fighting poverty in America, establishing Medicaid and Medicare, also Head Start and educational reform. And in the 1970s, the continued idea about how government and society can continually progress forward can be seen in areas of race and gender, the establishment of affirmative action, or in the 1990s, the Family Medical Leave Act, and even into the 2000s with the Affordable Health Care Act. Those are legacies of progressivism, and that is, how can we shape our own society? And one of the main components of that was that we could. So I think it's helpful to kind of trying to get into the minds of the progressives, or just people in America at the end of the 19th century. And you should have a good grounding of some of the ideas that were floating around and some of the issues that were going on in society. But just to recap a little bit of some of the growing pains of industrialization, is that you saw the emergence of what some people described as the robber baron, right? The Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, This small group of businessmen who obtained immense sums of wealth. These businesses and these businessmen often wielded great political and social power. It is Carnegie, it is Rockefeller here that's holding Washington in his hands, or this image right here that tries to show the political influence that various trusts wielded throughout the economy. Lincoln Steffens described this as he said, look, because politics is business, that's what's the matter with it. That's what the matter with everything. Art, literature, religion, journalism, law, medicine, they're all business, all as you have seen them. And so what he's referring to is this dynamic that businesses had such great political influence. On top of that, there were large economic swings during the time. So you would have these boom and bust periods that left people out of work, unemployed, struggling to survive. There were large, even in good times, there were large numbers living in poverty and terrible conditions that we've seen. The shadow of the skyscraper we saw was not a lovely place to live all the time. So what we have is you have a lot of changes going on in society. And people started to kind of reflect upon these changes, and people started to ask questions like, why did some find themselves benefiting in this world while others found themselves struggling to survive? Why? So people are ultimately asking, why is the world the way it is? So as people ask this question, why was the way the world it was? Some people started to associate these ideas that this is the natural evolution of society. One area this can be seen is in the emergence of social Darwinism that starts to apply the language of scientific beliefs of Darwin to society itself. This is coined by a guy by the name of Herbert Spencer. And these social Darwinists took up the language of evolution to frame their understanding of the growing gulf between the rich and the poor, as well as differences in cultures all over the world. The explanation they arrived at was that businessmen and others who were economically and socially successful were so because they were biologically and socially the fittest. Conversely, they reasoned that poor people were the weaker elements of society, and that is why they were not thriving. So the belief was is that in business and society, the fittest thrived, the cream of the crop, and those that did not have these characteristics did not succeed as well. You can continue to see themes of kind of the social Darwinism explanation of the world in literature itself with the emergence of naturalism and realism. And that is this turn away from the look of a Victorian look at the world where you romanticize aspects of chivalry or society or economics or warfare, and early 20th century literature really moved away from this romanticism to a much more natural, realistic look at society and life. This can be seen in works like Frank Norris's *Mateague*. This story depicts a dentist in the early 1900s in San Francisco and his wife. They are poor. They hit the lottery at some point, and it's a story of greed. And ultimately, in this story, the characters who are stronger survive longer than the characters who aren't. So again, what this is trying to tell us is that this world is kind of the people in this world are products in many ways of their environment and their own capability. On the other hand, there's another story that's interesting at this time is Stephen Crane's Maggie, a Girl of the Streets. We know Stephen Crane from the Red Badge of Courage, but Maggie, a Girl of the Streets is a story about this young lady who lives in a tenement slum who has an abusive, drunk father, and the kind of hardship that is set upon her just because of the world of who she is and where she lives at. And Maggie is this kind of this character who has a personality, who is has a lot of capability, but no matter what, is Maggie just continues to be a girl of the streets, and really her life is determined for her in this story, where it's just kind of she can't get out of the slum. And this is that deterministic element, is that hey, is that the world is the way it is because of certain things, and sometimes these are largely are out of your control. And so these were, so people saw this in different aspects of life, as this is why crime was prevalent, or prostitution, or poverty, or homeless. These circumstances were just the evolution of society, where the stronger tended to thrive and the weaker did not. On the other hand, some people did not like this explanation of the world, is that certain businesses thrive because they are fit and the other ones fail because they are unfit. Sometimes or that certain people did not do well in the world because of what they couldn't do. So I want to try to get a sense of who the progressives were and some of the things they were interested in. So the first thing to think of is the progressives were a group of people who rejected that social Darwinism deterministic outlook of life. So think, on one hand, you have one group of people, the social Darwinists, the determinists, like the Frank Norris Mateague work, or the Maggie, a girl of the streets. And that is, the world is evolving in ways and changing, and the fit are thriving in this society, and those lagging in poverty, or falling behind socially, or businesses that are failing, are the less fit and less evolved, and ultimately the less fortunate. That outlook kind of throws your hands up in a way and says things are the way they are because they are the way they are. Progressives, however, believe that the determination of the society we live in is not something beyond our control. Instead, it is something that can be shaped and sculpted into a better society that we want to live in. And they thought there was three ways that you could sculpt this society. One was through regulation, and that is to try to reduce and end abuses of power within the system, whether that be in the business's relationship to government and lobbying. Another way they thought that you could sculpt society was through reform, and that is by taking elements in our society and tweaking them and improving them. For instance, one of the areas that progressives looked at here was in government itself. Is there ways to make government more accountable to the people, more transparent? So how can we reform the political system in an effort of furthering our society or progress? And last, progressives thought you didn't just have to think about the things that already existed, but look into the future and see how you could create a better society, one that could improve. So they thought of things like conservation. For instance, Teddy Roosevelt set up the U.S. National Forest Service. And what that does is says, hey, we have these natural resources that need to be managed and conserved for the improvement of mankind. So now that we kind of understand the mindset of the progressive a little bit, a reaction to the determinist, a reaction to social Darwinism, someone interested in the issues, the societal issues of industrialization. Now we want to talk about a little bit where the origins of these attitudes come from. As we try to identify the origins of the progressive movement, one of the things that sticks out is how does the individual operate and what is their responsibility in a larger society, particularly one that is very individualistic, one that is hyper capitalistic at the moment, and has characteristics of attitudes of that every man for themselves. Now, this is a little complicated of a passage right here, but what it's trying to do is teased to light what is an individual's responsibility to the larger group, or is there a responsibility? Now, a social Darwinist would say, like, well, how could I change something that is so big? I am a product of that. I can't influence it. Well, a progressive, on the other hand, sees these connections between the individual and society. Now, this is not something that was exclusive to progressives. In fact, progressives kind of draw from an American Christian heritage, one that was very powerful in the 1800s with the Second Great Awakening and the emergence of the social gospel. The social gospel, Walter Rauschenbusch says, is an old message of salvation but enlarged and intensified. The individualistic gospel has taught us to see sinfulness of every human heart and has inspired us with faith in the willingness and power of God to save every soul that comes to him. So what he's referring to there is kind of the Christian attitudes of the 1700s, where it's like your individual relationship and your individual actions are the determination of salvation. But in the 1800s, Christian beliefs really started to be more popularized on the sanctity of a society rather than that of just the individual. So we could think of abolition in America. Is that in the 1830s, you get radical abolitionists who live in the North, who have no association with slavery, but feel that living in a society allows the sin of slavery is really a sin of theirs, even if they are not directly associated with the action. So this connection, this we're in it together type perspective. So he says this: the individualistic gospel has not given us an adequate understanding of the sinfulness of the social order and its share in the thesis of all individuals within it. It has not evoked the faith in the will and power of God to redeem the permanent institutions of human society from their inherited guilt of oppression and extortion. Both our sense of sin and our faith in salvation have fallen short of the realities under its teaching. The social gospel, he says, seeks to bring men under repentance for their collective sins and create a more sensitive and more modern conscience. It calls for us to have the faith of the old prophets who believed in the salvation of a nation. So the roots of progressivism can be, right away, we can identify them with a couple of things. One is a reaction to determinism and social Darwinism, right? A refutation of those ideas, if you will. And also we can see that as this growing sentiment is, or this, as this sentiment is growing in America, that you could have an effect on the nation as a whole, and you have a duty in many ways to do that. The question is, you have to first know what to fix before you can regulate, reform, and improve. So this is where I think one of the great storylines of the progressive comes in with the muckrakers. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we see a real activist journalism start to emerge. And that is, newspapers are butting into big businesses that are competing with each other. And one of the ways that they were able to grow their readership base, and magazines as well, was through investigative journalism. So names like Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell went about trying to expose ills of our society. Here's John Kneebone talking about the role of the muckrakers in bringing to light some of the issues in society that the progressives were really going to focus in on. He said, publicity and exposure are two very different things. Both do involve making a person, organization, or other commodity known to the public, but publicity seeks to present that commodity in a flattering light, serving the interest of the publicity seeker, but not necessarily the public interest. An expose, on the other hand, exposes to public scrutiny by means of facts and other pertinent information, and does with the intention of discrediting the objects of scrutiny. So when we think about progressivism, we need to first we start with some of the religious background and heritage, the origins in the social gospel. Next, you should think the muckrakers, who are activist journalists. They are investigative journalists who are trying to write these exposés about society to open society's eyes to these types of issues. Muckraker is a term that came from Teddy Roosevelt in a speech that he gave, where he referred to these people as trying to stir up the muck in society, right? So maybe that smell then encourages you to do something about it. Really, we've already seen some early signs of muckrakers and activist journalists. Thomas Nast is famous for his pursuits to rid New York City of Boss Tweed and his political ring and of corruption. One of the most famous of muckrakers is Lincoln Steffens, who was an activist journalist known for his work on exposing some of the corruption in American cities. This started in St. Louis and progressed into a larger work that would become titled The Shame of Cities. And here's a passage from Steffens' work where he's trying to tell you what he is trying to do. This first part is he tries to convey to the reader that his job is not just to report information, but to expose individuals to information that could lead to social change. So he says, this report is very unscientific, but I'm not a scientist. I'm a journalist. I did not gather with indifference all the facts and arrange them patiently for permanent preservation. I did not want to preserve. I wanted to destroy the facts. My purpose was no more scientific than the spirit of my investigation and reports. It was, as I said above, to see if the shameful facts, spread out in all their shame, would not burn through our civic shamelessness and set fire to American pride. That was the journalism of it. I wanted to move and convince. That is why I was not interested in all the facts, sought none that was new, and rejected half that were old. I was asked to expose something suspected. I couldn't, and why should I? Exposure of the unknown was not my purpose. The people, what they will put up with, how they are fooled, how cheaply they are bought, how dearly sold, how easily intimidated, and how led for good or evil, that was the inquiry. And so the significant facts were those only which everybody in each city knew, and of those only those of which everybody in every town would recognize, for their common knowledge of such things to be probable. But these, understated, were charged always to guilty persons when individuals were to blame, and finally brought home to the people themselves, who have the power, have also the responsibility, and they and those they respect and those that guide them. So it gets complicated at the end of the passage, but he said really what he's trying to do is present information to move and convince. And the information he was interested in was corruption that was rife throughout these budding American cities. And he said it's all over the place. Everybody knows about it. I'm putting it in front of your face to see if you'll do anything about it. And he says that he believes we have a responsibility to do that. So Lincoln Steffens is a great example of investigative journalism and how it's leading to social reform and political reform of, for instance, corruption in cities or political entities. Another example can be seen in Everybody's Magazine, and this was a story that was put out another interesting example of muckraking could be seen in Everybody's Magazine, which did a story on the Illinois Steel Company and the steel manufacturing sector, focusing on workplace injuries. So what they did is they looked at this one company, and there was 2,000 accidents the year that they looked at them. So 2,000 people were hurt on the job. They said, but many of these accidents extend only to the painful scorching of the legs. So 2,000 is all the accidents together. If you kept the figure conservative, though, and you reduced it to 1,200, they said 1,200 of these were serious injuries. They were of material consequence. So their story is highlighting how this one steel plant is a very dangerous place to work. But they said there would be no use in writing this article if this one factory was an anomaly. But they went on to write, but the plant in South Chicago is just an American plant, conducted according to American ideals. Its officials are men whom one is glad to meet and proud to know. And yet, in the course of the year, they had 1,200 serious physical injuries there. Must we continue to pay this price for the honor of leading the world in cheap and rapid production of steel and iron? So what this story is trying to show is that this isn't a bad business on its own, but a reflection of what it's like to work in the steel industry. Ida Tarbell, perhaps one of the most famous of muckrakers, known for her investigative reports on Standard Oil Trust, owned by John Rockefeller, she wrote that in order that their readers might have a clear and succinct notion of the processes by which a particular industry passes from the control of many to that of a few, they decided to publish a detailed narrative in the history and the growth of Standard Oil Trust. So she says we decided to report on horizontal integration. Is that where one industry is consolidated into the hands of a few? She said this was the trust. Standard Oil Trust was chosen for obvious reasons. It was the first in its fields, and it had furnished the methods, the charter, and the tradition for its followers. So she said, look, Standard Oil Trust is one of the leaders in the consolidation of industries. It satisfies most nearly the trust ideal for entire control of the commodity which it deals. So she goes on to say that it's one of the most powerful trusts. Its vast profits have led to its officers into various allied interests such as railroads, shipping, gas, copper, iron, steel, as well into banking and trust companies. And to acquiring and solidifying those interests, it has applied methods used to building up the oil trust. It is led in the struggle against legislation directed against trusts. Its power in the state and federal government, in the press, in the college, in the pulpit is generally recognized. The perfection of this organization of the Standard, the ability and daring with which it has carried out its projects, make it the preeminent trust of the world, the one whose story is best fitted to illuminate the subject of the combinations of capital. So I know that this is a lot to digest, and I'm throwing a lot of complicated ideas at you. But just to recap what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at the emergence of progressivism. What we know on one hand is that this is a reaction, a refutation of ideas like social Darwinism and determinism, right? And that is that these poor children right here aren't poor because they lack something, but instead a progressive would say that their circumstances can be changed, and through social advocacy and programs, we can uplift individuals out of poverty or deter crime, instill good morals in society. Progressives thought that society could be deliberately improved. That is, that things didn't evolve in ways that were beyond our control, but that instead could be shaped and manipulated to produce progress. So, for instance, as wealth accumulated in the hands of the few, progressives thought that there were ways that you could even the playing field, i.e., the graduated income tax that's passed under the Woodrow Wilson administration. On other instances, a progressive didn't think that as businesses grew, that they naturally evolved into big political powerful entities, but instead that there could be restrictions, regulations placed on businesses that limited the scope of their political power. Think of maybe laws on certain lobbying, for instance, pharmaceutical companies today, and how the regulations are posed on them in lobbying and even lobbying to doctors. They also thought that there were ways to prevent these giant economic swings in some ways. That if you could put in some safety nets, whether later in the Depression that comes to Social Security or disability later, Medicaid, Medicare, these ideas are that you can manufacture a certain progress in your society that could reduce poverty. Think the Great Society and the war on poverty, the improvement of living conditions and public health. You can think of the Food and Drug Act of the early 1900s and efforts through legislation and social activism to reduce crime rates. So the progressive is really under the impression that you don't have to throw your hands up in the air in despair and just take the world as it comes, but instead you can actively shape and sculpt the world you live in. The goals of the progressives can greatly be seen on the ground with activists, social activists trying to improve their communities and the society they lived in. The real social gospel behind it, and that message can largely be seen in their activism. One of the greatest examples of this, of urban reformers or grassroots activists, was Jane Addams in the Hull House. In 1889, Jane Addams and Helen Starr founded the Hull House, and this was a community center that, according to them, was meant to provide a higher civic and social life, to institute and maintain educational and philanthropic enterprises, and to investigate and improve the conditions in the industrial districts of Chicago. So at the Hull House, they instituted programs like penny savings programs where they would help people with their financial planning. They brought in healthcare specialists to be outreach to the community and uplift the community public health standards. They instituted literary clubs, music groups, and they even had things like daycare for people who were working so that those kids wouldn't be on their own in society. So think of them establishing the settlement homes, which the Hull House was what they called a settlement home, was a progressive effort to uplift their community locally. The legacy of this can be seen in institutions like the Boys and Girls Club. If you go to their website, it says the aim of the settlement or neighborhood house is to bring about a new kind of community life. It is in the community or neighborhood that people seek and fight for solutions to their immediate, concrete, daily, and local and immediate problems. Although the community remains the focus of the settlement's attention, it is through personalized and direct involvement with the individual in the context of family, often throughout a lifetime, that the settlement fosters and supports the values of fellowship and mutual support. Settlement homes were working in their community to address issues that were of a changing industrial and urbanizing America. As the economy was changing, as the landscape of American cities and the demographics of America were changing. All of these new challenges that we have tried to highlight so much in the last couple of weeks were placing pressures on society, whether that be homelessness or increases in orphans, whether or the challenges facing working parents having raising children, or one income families trying to survive in a world. These were new issues for America, and the progressives were on the ground trying to sculpt the community that they live in. Now, as progressives are on the ground working with the poor, working with the disaffected, trying to uplift their community, they quickly realized there were a lot of social issues that were bigger than they could influence, that had many of these issues extended beyond the reach of that of the settlement home, and they became national and international issues. Ideas about immigration or poverty or overcrowding and sanitation, workplace conditions, child labor, consumer protections. This required an entity much larger than the settlement home. Progressives would then look to the government as an opportunity to change society. But before they could use the government as a tool for progress, they had to fix the broken tool. At this point, we've seen some of the challenges facing the American Republic at the turn of the century. We saw the growing influence of business in politics, and in many ways, the outcry and reactions to this new industrial order reflected a society that felt underrepresented by the government. Progressives will seek to make government more democratic in a way. They look to root out corruption within the political system. They then turn to make elections more transparent, more accountable to politicians, more accountable to the public will. And there is an expansion of just public influence on the government in an effort to make it more transparent and accountable to the people. This is where we're going to turn our focus next with the progressives, is their effort to fix government, fix the broken tool of progress that then can be used to address these issues, these large social issues that related to the labor force, related to urbanization. To recap our discussion today, I want to turn just to the outline to show how we have been working through this conversation. Our focus was been on the emergence of the progressive era. We started by looking at reactions to this changing world. We talked about this binary response, one of social Darwinism and determinism, and then on the other hand, we talked about the emergence of progressives who believed that through regulation, reform, and improvement, society could be sculpted for progress. We then talked about the origins of progressivism and the relationship between it and its Christian heritage, the social gospel. We turned our focus to the importance of muckrakers in exposing social issue, and then concluded with urban reformers like Jane Addams and the Hull House on the ground in the trenches trying to shape the world they lived in response to the challenges of industrialization and urbanization. We're next going to focus our discussion on the broken tool, progressive political reforms, and their efforts to use the government as an advantageous tool in their quest for progress. I'd also like to encourage you to supplement this lecture and your understanding of the subject by reading your textbook. The information can be found in Chapter 21 of the OpenStax History textbook that goes over progressive era. Make sure that you also are accessing all the supplemental materials in Moodle, including the presentation.